My name is Kira McClelland and I have the absolute privilege of representing the wonderful team who are behind Westpac's Ruby today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful land on which we're meeting on today from wherever you are dialing in from. For me, that's the land of the Awabakal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As we talk to equity today, I would also like to acknowledge that there is a lot more work that needs to be done to forge reconciliation and create a country that we're all supported and recognise all people and our history. For those of you who are new to Ruby and PepTalkHer Lunch and Learns, welcome to this very special International Women's Day event. This is a very safe and inspiring and supportive community that we've built on over the last 2 years. We launched these monthly events in an effort to provide a platform where women and men can share their stories, challenges, and triumphs in an effort to share with our community and for us to be able to listen and learn and take action. So whether that's in your business, your family, your well-being, and most certainly your finances. But I'm so proud of this event series and the wealth of resources that sits behind these conversations that we have available on Ruby and PepTalkHer. So you can go and check that out in your own time whenever it might suit you. But to our incredible speakers who have joined us for this very special event today, thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories and how you've challenged biases and stereotypes and forged ahead. But not only that, you're also leveraging your platform to lend your voice to others so that they know that they're not alone and that they too can create a world that is safe and equal for all. So thank you. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Meggie.
Thanks so much, Kira. Really appreciate you hosting this conversation today. And welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let me know in the chat where you are joining us from today. We would love to hear from you. As always, if you have any asks, if you have any questions for the panel today, please pop them in the chat and we will get to as many of those as we can during our time today together. I'm so excited that we've got 3 absolute powerhouses joining us today, as well as all of you in the Ruby Connection community. So thank you for giving up your time. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome today gold medal Paralympian and massive change maker, Madison de Rozario. She was the youngest athlete on the Australian Paralympic team and had a sensational 2021. And no doubt 2022 already off to an amazing start. One thing, actually, Madison, I was actually there when you won the New York City Marathon, which was the first, well, I wasn't at the finish line. I saw you kind of zooming past. So that was very exciting. And what an amazing moment, because I believe you were the first Australian, right, to win that race. Very cool.
Australian woman, yeah, thank you.
I hope you got to celebrate that night. We were all like beyond stoked watching you anyway from the sideline. So that's amazing. It's awesome to have you with us here today. Really excited to hear from you and learn a little bit more about your journey. Also, Jarin, welcome to you. Really excited to hear a little bit more about your story, trading in your police badge for an entrepreneur's cap, which is really cool. You've got an amazing activewear brand, Jarin Street, which is the first Indigenous retailer in Westfield shopping centres around the country. So super incredible feat. And also really interesting to hear more about the fact that you co-founded Indigenous business collective called Trading Black on a mission to tackle exploitative behaviour in the Indigenous business sector and to show young women how to be a boss. So we're going to learn heaps from you today, Jarin. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate you.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I can't wait. And also the brilliant Sunita Gloster, CEO and non-executive director and advisor to UN Women Australia. Sunita, really looking forward to hearing from you and learning from your 30 years of experience as a media marketing guru and the fact that you spend so much of your time, and I know this is a huge passion for you, convincing businesses and making the case that diversity, gender equality and inclusion are not just important, but they're actually key to growth and success. So welcome to you as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So listen, let's kick things off and just, Sunita, I want to come to you first. Can we just set the scene? How does Australia compare to the rest of the world, particularly as it pertains to gender equality?
Really good question. So, if I was to ask everyone on this call for a progressive, developed nation like Australia that chases and likes to punch above its weight on many rankings, including and especially sport, you'd probably assume that we'd place higher on gender equality than 50th, especially when New Zealand ranks 4th. And you know how competitive we are across the channel. So you don't have to take my word for it. There is a global gender gap index, which is published by the World Economic Forum, and it tracks gender equality on 4 dimensions: on economic participation and opportunity, which is jobs, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. On education, we're right up there. But of 156 countries ranked, we still sit at 50. And most of our Western peer countries are way above 25. So that's not a great position for us. And, even if you were to drill down on all the statistics around equality in general in Australia, it's not a great picture. For a lucky country, 1 in 3 women in Australia still experience violence or sexual harassment. On average, 1 woman is killed every week at the hands of someone she knows. We spend twice as much time on unpaid labour. We account for less news sources. We retire with less money.
Yeah. And
that's before you layer in people of women of colour, non-binary women, women with a disability, our First Nations women, LGBTQI communities. The stats just get worse. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Madison, hearing this, and I know we were chatting about this a little earlier, does any of this surprise you, the ranking in terms of where Australia sits from your experience?
It's funny. I've gone to travel a lot and definitely see a lot of different places. And on the outside, I think, we do come across very, very well. And that's what I find so interesting is it's almost as though everyone I speak to wants to do the correct thing when it comes to genuine, authentic diversity. And we want more information, and there's just not much. There is access to it, but so many people live in ignorance, not knowing where to look for, not believing it's their responsibility. And one of the things that we talk about in this space a lot is the fact that this conversation is being had by the minority groups themselves. And while we are the more knowledgeable ones in this space, obviously we have the lived experience and understanding, when it comes from us, it seems like larger communities are more willing to dismiss that. When it comes from somebody who looks like the person that you want to change, it's almost like it's a call to action. And so one thing that we don't do very well here, I find, is in terms of our allies and how those conversations go. We have a lot of minorities, like I'm also a woman with a disability, and I can speak to this all the time, and I could say all of the right things, but it's never going to have the same impact as the going to work alongside someone with a disability 9 to 5 and then amplifying that voice. When it comes from your straight white cis able-bodied men, it almost comes across as a call to action. I feel like that is what we're missing in this space, and I feel like this International Women's Week, and I think a lot of us feel the same way. There is it almost feels like we're preaching to the choir. We are telling women who agree with us already that this is it. And while that's amazing because we're kind of helping share stories and provide language, and I lean so heavily on the women that I speak to this week, and I grow and how I want to speak about things changes, but what we haven't been able to do is get that allyship where it needs to be. And I think that's one of the big things that will change the landscape here in Australia.
I think you're speaking what a lot of people are thinking. I really appreciate you sharing that, Madison. And Jarin, what about you? How are you feeling about International Women's Day this year and the intersectionality in the conversations that are going on, or lack thereof, should I say?
Yeah. Before I dive into that, I'll do my protocol and acknowledge country. I'm coming to you guys on Gamaragal country in Sydney, and paying my respects to elders past and present, paying my respects to any other Aboriginal people that are tuning in, and also acknowledging country for where everyone's coming in from. So I'll jump in there, and thank you, Kira, for that introduction and acknowledgement as well. Yeah, as Sunita said, and just going back to the last question as well, the representation of Aboriginal women across all of those areas is overwhelming. We know this. And that's, a global fact. And just going on to what Madison said about the conversations, I'm very close. I'm read by really strong, prominent Aboriginal women who are leaders, and they're the women that guide me through life, my elders. And what really breaks my heart is when I hear them say that we're having the same conversations now that they had when they were my age.
And it just really, it makes me so angry, you know. How is that possible? These women are powerhouses, and the things that they achieved in this country, Aboriginal women have been on the front line from the beginning. How can we still be having these conversations? So that really, I mean, I feel the responsibility of that very deeply, and my kids feel the responsibility of that very deeply as well. They have their own bonds with their elders, but this is something that's not unique to me. These are conversations happening in all Aboriginal communities across the country, particularly with women. And I do get frustrated. I'll also say, when you ask me about International Women's Week, I've never, in my previous career, I've never really participated in these events.
Right.
So these conversations in these spaces are very new to me. You know, obviously in Aboriginal community, my own families, in my own worlds, always. But yeah, I'm still, like, I guess, exploring this space. And what I see as frustrating is just the lack of conversation about what's really affecting women and what's really speaking to these disparities. How can we have a conversation about gender equality without talking about racism? How can we have a conversation about this stuff without talking about discrimination? It makes no sense. So yeah, I appreciate these conversations in these weeks. They're conversations that should be being had every single day, and we can't have them without talking about intersectionality.
Yeah, and making sure that it's not just like a splash in the pan, to your point, Jarin, like a one-off kind of event, a feel-good thing, and then 364 days of kind of the status quo, which we know, to Sunita's point, in Australia is not fair and equitable. And also, I'd just love to acknowledge that I'm coming from the Lenape lands today, and want to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging here as well. Madison, I want to ask you a question, because, you know, I think Jarin raised the issue that the fight for equality in Australia has been going on forever, right? Like, Indigenous women have been fighting for women for generations. Women before us have been having these conversations. And it's interesting because we've seen, you know, Grace Tame dominate the headlines recently, given her Australian of the Year award, and her courage coming forward, sharing her story as well. I think it's interesting to note, you know, the amount of vilification that she received for her frankness. And I want to talk about this because I think, you know, some of the traits that women are criticized for in the media are often the same ones that are in fact celebrated when we see them in men. So I wanted to kind of ask you, Maddie, like, how did you observe this playing out, and how have you balanced in your career, your identity as a top athlete and the way that that's kind of then perceived in the public eye?
So that's really interesting, because I think identity is so incredibly multifaceted, and you're right. So many traits that we applaud in men, we absolutely vilify in women. And when we look at sport, the traits that we demand of athletes are traits that we also vilify in women. And so finding a balance and who you are as an athlete is almost an uphill battle, and one that so many of us have had to participate in. And I find the interesting thing about Grace is that, yes, she is angry, and yes, she is criticized for it, but she's also celebrated for it. She's someone who's been able to be very angry very publicly and still make waves and have the impact that she is searching for in that space. And yes, it has come with its amount of criticism, but not nearly as much as the women who've come before her. You know, this movement has been led by women of color. You know, we've come far before, and those conversations have existed forever. And yet, when we speak about it, that anger there is no part of it that's celebrated. It's entirely angry, and it's almost like it's not a choice that women of color are making. It's just in the nature of it, as opposed to when Grace speaks, she's obviously a beautiful young woman, and the way that comes across has been received so differently. And I think that's more what we have to take from that is this feminist movement. There's so many people at the center of it in the conversation. It's individuals that we kind of elevate to a different level, and it's entirely based on how they're received by the public, and that is dictated by a very a mold that doesn't benefit the movement as its whole, and it doesn't lend itself to the intersectionality. And so one of the things that I find, I respect a lot about Grace is she does take the time every time she speaks to acknowledge that where the numbers are high, that violence against women with disabilities is disproportionately high. Violence against First Nations women is horrendous, and she uses her platform to do. What we need now is for almost her to see that space to have those voices coming directly from the source. And I think that's the direction that this needs to move in. I think, you know, a lot of us on the call probably feel this way already about this, that voice that needs to be heard needs to be a genuinely intersectional voice that represents our community as authentically as possible.
Jarin, I want to come to you on this question in a minute. Sunita, just quickly, what do you make of what Madison's just said? Because I think it is a really interesting conversation, and it's important to have, isn't it? That actually, when these messages come from white women, it's actually perceived quite differently, right? Than as opposed to when we hear from women of color in the media talking about their experience of racism, of being abused. What do you make of the conversation, Sunita?
Look, you know, the thing I think is that if anyone gives you the mic to try and make change or puts you in a seat where you can influence the conversation, take it, right? So Grace was given a platform and she chose to be a very noisy advocate for the things that she's passionate about. And I think she did an incredible job of galvanizing the country behind some change messages. Chanel Contos, Brittany Higgins, they've all done it. Now, yes, they all fit a certain kind of demographic, but I think the enormous good they've done in starting conversations, you have to take that moment when you get it, no matter who you are. If you're a person of color, if you are Grace Tame, if you're an older woman like I am, and, you know, we hold up signs that say, we can't believe we're still protesting this shit, right? It's been going for so long. I think, you know, it's incumbent on everyone, because there are so few women's voices in the narrative still. There are still, you know, such systemic underrepresentation of women in leadership that when you get shoved onto the stage, regardless of who you are, do something with it.
Jarin, I want to ask you, there's an interesting comment that's come through, which I think, Sunita, speaks to your point as well, about this year, potentially the International Women's Day conversation has felt in some ways tokenistic, without a lot of tangible action. Jarin, for people who are joining today and who do want to help support, who do want to move the needle, and who do want to be genuine allies, what would your advice be to them in terms of if people on this call today are looking to help support this conversation from an intersectional lens, what can people do?
Gosh, that is a massive question.
Let's solve the problems of the world in the next half hour, Jarin.
I'll do my best. I think, first of all, I mean, if we're going to talk about breaking the bias, like understanding that we're all responsible for this, one of the very strong and thick barriers that I have experienced in my life in various different spaces and professionally is who takes up space and when, and are they the most appropriate person? And I agree with Sunita that when you do get a platform, yes, you should take it, but you should also bring that appropriate voice with you. And I think for me, that's critical. Like I've seen, you know, non-Aboriginal women who fit a certain mold, who I've worked with, who have spoken to things affecting my community when I am an empowered, educated, strong Aboriginal woman from community, and at the time in a police uniform. You know, I couldn't have hit any more spaces to have a voice, and yet I didn't. So I think the responsibility to empower the appropriate voices, to lean into that leadership when it does pop up, that's a big one for me. And, you know, if we're talking about unpacking, what was the second half of that question? It was so big. I just went straight into it.
It was a big question. Well, I think, like, from an ally's perspective, and I want to hear from you, Jarin, in a minute, I want to understand whether there have been experiences, I'm sure there's been plenty, where you've experienced stigma or racism in your transition from being a police officer into an entrepreneur, but specifically people joining us today who want to be an ally, who want to be a supporter, who don't want this to be a tokenistic, you know, conversation or one-off. They actually want to help create change. Like, what do you think is the most powerful one thing that people could do to help move the needle, do you think, to support Indigenous women, to support all women?
Well, in terms of a tangible action, buy from Aboriginal businesses. An overwhelming majority of retail businesses are run by Aboriginal women. Come to Trading Black. We have a whole host of retail businesses that you can buy direct from, and the impact that your purchase will have by buying from those women is 100%. So you know that you're buying from the right people. So that would be, you know, a very easy thing to do. But back to my original point would be, you know, empowering people to have a voice in spaces that are theirs. That's a really critical one to me. And yeah, I think that people get really, I don't know, it's like this stranglehold, like a feeling of, if I allow that person to shine, somehow I'm going to fall behind, or I'm not going to get an opportunity or something like that. The most empowering thing that I've ever done in my life repeatedly is empowered other people, particularly young women. So I just think that that one action flies in the face of what you're trying to do. I don't know if that answers it properly, but
no, it does. It's really helpful. And listen, we would love to hear from you in the audience today as well. Let us know in the comments, what tangible actions have you been taking in your everyday life or in the workplace to help move the needle, to be an ally? And it's interesting, from one of the polls that we did, almost the entire audience has experienced bias in the workplace, either every day or occasionally, right? There's about 17% of people who say they've rarely experienced it, but the rest of us are experiencing this on a really regular basis, right? Which speaks to the statistics that Sunita sort of ran us through in the first instance. And so let's talk about that a little bit further. You know, one of the things that we're really passionate about at PepTalkHer, the company that I run, is around specifically closing the gender pay gap, because that's something that impacts all women, unfortunately, in Australia, and it's disproportionately worse for women of colour. Madison, how do you balance that? Because we know the conversation with women in sport in particular, when we want to talk about the pay gap, let's talk about the pay gap with women in sport. What have your experiences been? Can you share any of the experiences that you've had in terms of contract negotiations and pay with your experience versus potentially some of your male sporting colleagues?
My big thing when it comes to pay stuff is just to have the conversation with your male counterparts, and that's huge. And before I sign any contract, I check in with the Olympic equivalent of myself and the male equivalent of myself, and make sure that that's where it needs to be. And I think we do have this privacy around these things, and I feel like it's ingrained in all of us, and as women, I think we're so taught to be non-confrontational in these spaces and to just kind of accept crumbs sometimes. But I think one of the amazing things that I'm seeing on the sporting side of it is this group of young women athletes coming through in our 20s and early 30s who are kind of just demanding more space. And I feel like there is this unity around that, and there is this understanding of the intersectionality that comes with that as well, that I'm finding with women coming through. And I think one of the big things that, you know, in sports specifically, sport is such a pervasive industry, and the impact that it has on the community is significant. And so for myself, I don't believe the biggest issue is in the specific pay gap. While it is significant, it's the impact that pay gap has on communities and the value that we place on women over men doing the exact same job in such a public space. And so, you know, we have all the arguments as to why we don't pay our women in sport enough. And it's like, it's not as, you know, easy to commercialize, which is a joke. And it's, you know, they're not as strong or as fast. And it's like, bro, you're watching this through your TV screen, you can't tell. And so we have all these reasons of why we refuse to do it. And the reality is, like, none of them hold any water in any circumstances. But the reason we invest so much in sport as viewers and as administration is because of the impact it has on community. And sport is very government funded in a lot of areas. And the reason for that is because of the way it alleviates the burden on the healthcare system and in spaces around mental health. And right now, what we are doing is saying that it's okay if our women and our girls don't have the same health treatment as our boys and men, and that's significant. On top of that, we know that, you know, women in high level decision-making roles often have some kind of sporting background in their childhood, not at any elite level necessarily, but they did participate in sport throughout their childhood. And so by this pay gap and not showing pathways, we're not just not paying our women as much as our men, which is obviously horrific. We're also gatekeeping careers, we're gatekeeping decision-making roles. The economy is shaped on men, and all of these things are actually impacted by sport, which, you know,
we've got a technical issue there, but Sunita, I want to come to you on this question of the pay gap. Because, you know, as Madison said, it is pervasive and we hear these kind of arguments for it. And it's interesting, I'm getting a lot of comments through in the chat, and please keep them coming, about pay secrecy clauses. So unfortunately, we know in Australia, they still exist. So pay secrecy clauses are something that you might find hidden deep in your contract, your employment contract, that actually stipulates you're not allowed to discuss your compensation with colleagues. And if you do, you may lose your job. That has been outlawed in America. It has been outlawed in the United Kingdom, but it still exists in Australia. Sunita, tangibly, for people joining today who are kind of having some of these challenges, trying to figure out, we're having a lot of suggestions sent through. Talk to men in your life about pay, talk to your children about pay, normalize talking about money, which I think is great. From your corporate experience, what would your top piece of advice be?
Look, I think speak up, right? Use your voice in lots of different ways. You have a right to ask if you are being paid fairly and equally, and you should ask. The fact that we have a gender pay gap nationally of 13.8%, which shows some improvement on the previous year at 14%, is bad. I'm not suggesting it's not. What's worse, though, is the inaction when employers discover that they have pay gaps in their businesses. So the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which does this analysis, finds that 85% of employers still post pay gaps year on year, and half of them do nothing about it when they find the pay gaps. That I find criminal, right? So yes, you've done the survey, you've done the analysis, and now what, right? So the gap between knowledge and action is what we actually need to address. Now, if you jump on the Workplace Gender Equality Agency website, you can search your company if they're involved. If they're not, make a big noise about it in your surroundings. Ask the question, why are we not part of this? You can ask it in a non-threatening way. You can then go and search your company and look at how the statistics show up. And I think everybody, as both Madison and Jarin have said, there are more voices on this now, and everybody has a voice and should use it, because, if you're not getting paid fairly, you need to be asking why, and you need to push that.
And it's a good point that you raised, Sunita. There is actually data available. The Women and Gender Equality Agency, we're going to put a link to that in the chat for you, wgia.gov.au. They have up-to-date data for companies. I believe it's employing more than 50 people actually have to publicly report that data. So take a look at that. And if you haven't already, check out the pay gap bot that came out of the United Kingdom yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yes, it was yesterday. Really interesting, calling out companies who were talking about International Women's Day on social media, but not necessarily actioning it in terms of their pay. Jarin, let's chat about pay. So you and the inequity that comes with that for women. You were a police officer and now you're an entrepreneur. Have you had any experiences of inequalities, particularly as it pertains to pay equity?
Yeah, so I joined the New South Wales Police Force and I served for 12 and a half years. So I got out in mid-2020, which was right in the middle of lockdown or around that time. And so it wasn't that long ago. And towards the end of my career was doing my side gig with starting my business, which I guess I then ended up stepping into. But in terms of pay disparities, you start on the same pay. It was more around opportunities where I saw and career progression that I really saw, the gaps. And certainly I felt the brunt of that throughout my career. I hung around there. I gave it my best shot. But after 12 and a half years and feeling like my career was at an absolute stalemate, it had completely stopped. And things around when I had children and things that was said to me when I had kids, I actually had somebody say to me, who's going to look after your kids if you want to go for this promotion? And I was like, and at the time, my other half, who was also a serving police officer, these are questions, obviously, he had never been asked ever. So certainly there were instances of that. Also, I'm an Aboriginal woman in the police force. I come from community. Like I felt like I was hitting certain barriers that wasn't my skill set and my expertise coming from that space kind of didn't fit into that world. And so, yeah, in terms of career progression, that was definitely something that I saw. That was basically the ultimate reason why I ended up leaving and stepping into entrepreneurship. The self-determination piece was critical to me.
Interesting. The difference that you experienced versus your partner in the same industry is all quite stark, isn't it? Please keep your questions coming through. If you've got questions for our panelists, we will get to as many of those questions as we can. Maddie, I want to ask you a question. You've talked a lot publicly about the difference between representation and visibility, particularly, given your role that you often have as a spokesperson for disability and women's rights and equality. I think it's important for people on the call today to understand, why is that distinction so important, and how does that impact you in the work that you're doing?
There is a very distinct difference between representation and visibility, and in terms of the progression for so many of us in minority groups, it does start with representation, where in that space, so your entire identity is whatever minority group it is that you are representing in that space. You don't get to lean into every aspect of who you are. You are simply very tokenistic, but at least you are seen. And so that's where I feel like a lot of us have gotten very stuck. And, I definitely still get invited to events as, because I don't yet have a woman with a disability in that space. And you want to make up, basically a diversity check. And that's representation. It's not fair on the individual that is expected to occupy that space, but it's also not fair on the entire community they do represent. In Australia, 20% of us live with disability. And if every single time you see a person with a disability, their job is to be a disabled person, how are you ever meant to learn who you are? You have no role models, you have no pathways in that space. And then compound that, the 80% of, the rest of Australia also only ever sees people with disabilities as their entire identity. And so there's no authenticity in that. Whereas visibility is when you are turning up in all of your power. You are turning up as every single part of who you are, and you are an entire human, and that whatever minority group that is a small part. And for myself, I'm a very proud woman with a disability, and I love every single part of who I am, and I want to turn up with that being a part of my identity. But I'm also a woman of color. I'm also an athlete. I'm also, every other thing that I am, and you want to see all of that. And when I think about I think about little girls with disabilities who look like me, getting to grow up and see someone in some kind of spotlight that is multifaceted. I didn't have that. Anytime I saw a person with a disability, that was their entire role. And so you begin to internalize that. You begin to believe that is who you are. And you begin to almost create this false sense of pride for it, and you kind of add more value to that part of your identity than isn't necessary. You don't get to explore every single other part of yourself. And so that is the difference between visibility and representation, and why visibility is infinitely more impactful than representation could ever be.
It must be exhausting, is it, Maddie?
It is. I also feel like, and we don't see too many people with disabilities in media in Australia, and the ones that we do see are Paralympians, and you can't expect the most physically elite version of disability to be what we decide disability looks like. It's unrealistic, and it's also doesn't do justice to that entire beautiful 20% of our community. It also means that there's this enormous responsibility every time any one of us speaks to be doing justice to 20% of Australia, and it is incredibly exhausting. I think a lot of us can relate to that when we're coming from the marginalized communities, and it is, and it's not fair on anybody. And we're so much better as a community when we embrace every single one of us from every single corner of our communities, and moving in that direction. I think I know as a Paralympian, all of my teammates, that is something we all are using our platforms to do, to have that conversation and to take the spotlight away from ourselves as elite athletes who are the most privileged of disability that there could ever possibly be, and shine it where it is more deserving and where it needs more more elevation. And so it's moving in the right direction.
Not quickly enough, but we're grateful to you and the advocacy that you do. And Jarin, I want to just ask you a question. Madison mentions the power of visibility, and particularly as role models. Do you feel that sense of responsibility as well? Is that a bit of a part of the reason behind you starting your business?
Can we just listen to Maddie all day?
Isn't she amazing?
I just want to hear her speak. So role models are a big thing in my life. As I said before, I was raised by, a big bunch of very strong and a long line of very just staunch, incredible Aboriginal women. So in my life, women have always been, the powerhouses and the leaders. And so when I stepped out into the big wide world and found the paternalism across spaces, that was a huge shock for me, because that's not how my family operates. And that's now why, looking back, I understand how hard they've had to fight and why they got the way they do, hitting those barriers. But yeah, in terms of visibility, absolutely. So that was the one key factor why stepping into a bricks and mortar location was so important. You know, you walk around shopping centres, do you ever see an Aboriginal owned store? You might see a gift store down in tourist places. Generally, they're non-Aboriginal owned and you don't know where the product's coming from. So yeah, I love shopping. Who doesn't? You know, I like it. I like my active wear, and I just wanted to find a shop or create a space where Aboriginal businesses could be celebrated and authentic and straight from community. So that visibility piece to the broader public was that part of the business concept. But in terms of me individually, yeah, I think we all carry that responsibility, don't we? We all want to set good examples for our daughters, for our sons, for our nieces and nephews. But I think the thing that I'm probably leaning into now I'm most proud of is just, and sometimes I don't always feel this way, but I at least try to, is stepping into those spaces fearlessly and in my own power. And, you know, as Maddie said, leaning into all of the power that I have, because it's not just me. I'm here as a result of generations of women who have put that into me. So I have a responsibility, and I'm very proud in doing that. I hope I do a good job of it. And if I don't, I've got nans and nannies who are going to kick me in the backside and show me how to do a good job. So I'm always accountable anyway. But yeah, definitely, I have a lot of young women that work for me at the moment in our store. And we all talk about, and young men too, these incredible young people who we talk about their business aspirations and the things that they're talking about. I am so excited. And I also have to give my little 10-year-old a plug. She's a 10-year-old businesswoman. She's got hustle for days and she's way better at this than I am. So that for me, I can just, yeah, that's my happy place right there.
Well, Jarin, please put in the chat. Let us know what her business is so we can all help support her. I don't know if she's on IG, whatever. Let us know.
Lani's Curry Creations. I'll put it in.
Put it in. They're going to get bombarded with interest. And I think what's one of the positives, I suppose, that, you know, the negative that we've seen from COVID is that it's disproportionately impacted women in the workforce. One of the positives is that we are seeing more and more women, Sunita, starting their own businesses. And I'd love to know from you, you know, the wonderful thing about what Jarin's doing, starting her own business, you know, taking that financial situation and her career into her own hands, I think is really exciting. And we are seeing more and more women starting their own businesses, particularly in the developed world. How important is that, do you think, from a financial empowerment perspective, Sunita? Because we know in Australia, sadly, the fastest growing group of homelessness is actually women over the age of 55, which is not a statistic that any of us should be proud of. What are you seeing the data tell us in this area, Sunita?
Look, I think, you know, you just can't underestimate how significant financial empowerment is. You know, you just can't understate it in terms of achieving gender equality for any groups that are women. You know, the empowerment of women is about enabling them to generate an income, to access essential services, and to sort of protect basic standards of living, right from, and I hate the phrase, but from cradle to grave, right? So it's all the way through to retirement savings. And we know that women end up retiring on less superannuation and savings than what men do. So, you know, the primary causes of poverty, of illness, of inequality are cultural, financial, and legal. So, you know, they're the things that block women from either doing things or feeling like they can do things. So not addressing financial empowerment or financial confidence or the structural things that prevent women to have equal opportunity and access to financial resources, which still exists. It's hard to believe, it is critical in this debate, really. So, you know, it's great that there are conversations like this which table the shared and the lived experience that, you know, women that have either worked in an executive life or are now entrepreneurs or thinking about being an entrepreneur, to just start to being aware of the things that they need to address if they're going to start protecting their financial empowerment.
And we've had a question through, Sunita, actually specifically about the impact of childcare and caring responsibilities. And we know that that is one of the factors that does contribute to the pay gap. Although I will say, even when you account for that and take that out of the equation, there is still a pay gap that persists. But Sunita, should you be in a position where you were able to sort of put in place a policy or change or legislation, is there anything that you would like to see happen in Australia so that we can move up that gender index?
Yeah, look, I think quite a few things actually. You know, it's not legislation here that parental leave is non-gendered. Lots of great companies do make it equal for men and women to take, 18 weeks parental leave, but it's not law. So it still enforces a stereotype that it is the female that can take the parental leave and the male still gets 2 weeks, right? That has to change. Right. You know, I'm blessed in where I am because my husband chose to retire when we started having a family and I went back to work super quick. But he left his job to look after the children. And so those are the things that need to change, because the expectation for young women in the industry, and particularly in my sector, is that when they start getting to, in their middle to early 30s, that they're going to have to clock off, that the work-life balance, which is a terrible phrase because I love work and I like life and they shouldn't have to be balanced, but that there's a compromise to be made, and the statistics never lie. 15% of women say that they are discriminated against in both performance evaluation as well as promotion once they start having a family. And on average, men get promoted when they move into parental situations. And, the stats say they get 2% pay rises on those situations. And there's a lot of fist pumping and high-fiving. That shit's got to change, right? It needs to be much more equal in that space. And that's where I think the government, and in the absence of government, business can step in and start doing some of that.
Jarin, from your experience, when you had your kids, was in thinking of the break the bias concept, is there a bias that you wish had been broken when you were going through that experience, or a policy that was in place that would have better helped support you and protect you during that time of your life?
Oh, absolutely. Having children interrupted my career progression. That's fact. Why? There's no reason why that should have happened. But it did. And I saw peers that, I'm a high performer, like my job was very important to me. So for that to happen, because I had children, it made no sense hitting that barrier. So yeah, certainly if there was some sort of policy or protection around that, I would have leaned into that wholeheartedly. And Sunita, I'm in the same position now. My partner doesn't work. He stays home and looks after the kids. And I'm very privileged to be able to work that way. And he's wonderful. And, and this is how our family dynamic operates. But speaking to just entrepreneurship and with Trading Black and what we do, and I mentioned earlier that a large representation of our retail businesses, Aboriginal-owned businesses, are run by women. That's a factor. They're at home rearing children. And so the workplace it didn't fit what their family needs were. So what Trading Black does, if we look at the barriers that these businesses or these business owners are facing, it's not just inaccessibility as a woman, it's inaccessibility to generational business knowledge and how to run these businesses, how to get access to the mainstream, which is why our Westfields shop is so important. It's why our online store is so important, and Trading Black holds space for that direct pathway. So you're talking mums making scrunchies and doing incredible artwork and creating baby gear and, aromatherapy and all sorts of incredible things, but then also chuck in having to balance their cultural integrity in their businesses too. These women are superheroes, they deserve to be bought from, and yet people don't know who they are. So if you do want to know who these businesses are, come to Trading Black. A big part of the work that we have to do is mentoring our businesses to get to that point to be able to sell to mainstream. So we're doing all the heavy lifting. We're not funded. We do it without any support. So if anyone does want to help us out with this, get in touch. We need all the help we can get. These women in particular, I think in terms of Trading Black founding members, we have 2 men, the rest are women. and we came together on that basis. So it is an economic pathway, and it's a sustainable one too, that's self-determined by Aboriginal people. It's critical.
Put your money where your mouth is and check out Trading Black on Instagram. We've popped the link in there. Make sure you check out Maddie and Sunita on social media as well. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll wrap up the conversation. But just quickly before we do, Maddie, the concept of breaking the bias this year and focusing on that as allies today, any tangible or practical advice that you can give to people that you would love for them to sort of take away and keep front of mind, so that today is not just a splash in the pan and a one-off, so that it actually creates tangible change from the grassroots, from all of us here today?
I would say it is twofold. I think for us personally, when it comes to breaking the bias, it's about, leaning into your own authenticity and working out what that is. And I think so often we will end up in roles for reasons that aren't our own, because we think it's where we belong and it's what we've been told, and and you try and be a version of yourself that you think will serve the job or the role you're filling, rather than making sure it serves you instead. And so I think leaning into your authenticity, and when it gets challenging, and I think in every single industry and everything we do, it gets to a point where you're required to make sacrifices, and when it gets that hard, somebody else's reasons are never going to be enough. And I think that's when so many of us fall apart. And that's been a huge part of my career. I feel like, I had a second phase to my career that started after I had that moment. And so my advice for us personally would be to find your authenticity and make your decisions around that. I think when it comes to, the second half of that, I would say that we can all very actively and easily do is in the way we speak and the language that we use. And I think language is so incredibly powerful. And when we talk about, say people with disabilities, that seems to be at the forefront of the conversation that we have. If we're describing somebody, that is the first thing that we say, even when it just is not relevant to the story. And I think that kind of, just reinforces that idea that this is an important factor of this person. And it reinforces that identity on not just that person, but that entire community. And so I think the way in which we speak is incredibly important, and it shapes how, the people around us begin to believe. And we obviously, the way we think is shaped by the language. And so that's something that we can all do so actively, for every single part of our lives. And I think it's so important.
We are unfortunately out of time. I feel like you've all got to do a TED talk, and we want to watch all of them, because you are fascinating. You have so much knowledge to share. Thank you for imparting your wisdom to all of us here today. Thank you kindly to Westpac's Ruby Connection for hosting today's conversation. And thank you to all of you for being allies, for showing up today and being a part of this community. We so appreciate you. We will be back next month, but in the meantime, please make sure you do check out and spend money on Trading Black. Check out Maddie on Instagram. Her feed is awesome. And check out Sunita. She's on social media as well. We've popped the link to her Twitter in the chat. But very grateful for all of you participating today. Have a wonderful and safe weekend, and we will see you all next month. Thanks so much, everyone.